Yesterday, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki pushed back against claims that the U.S. is engaging in a proxy war with Russia. Let's watch.
The Washington Post polls found that 8 in 10 Americans are expressing worries about a wider war and the possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. And given that Russia has made it clear that they believe NATO has engaged in a proxy war, what's the White House's message to worried Americans right now?
Well, I think it's an important step to take and a responsibility of everyone to make clear this is not a proxy war. I know that is the Russian talking point on this, but it is not a proxy war. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine. NATO is not involved. The United States is not fighting this war, so I think it's important and vital for all of us to not repeat the Kremlin talking points on this front.
A little Freudian slip there in her thinking, Russian and Republican. Despite the Biden administration's denials, however, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's claims that the U.S. intends to weaken Russia through its support of Ukraine have led foreign policy analysts to identify a, quote, policy shift in the Biden administration. Executive Director of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi, tweeted, quote, as the war continues, the goalposts change and objectives that earlier were flat out rejected suddenly become no-brainers. Policy is driven by tactical reactions to events, not strategy, and objectives are changed on the go without much deliberation. What could go wrong?
Well, now Dr. Parsi joins us to expand. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you here. So you do think that this was maybe sort of a shift, that maybe it didn't begin with this whole idea of being in a proxy war with Russia, but now it is absolutely potentially one. I mean, what is your take on where we were and where we are now?
Look, there's going to be a long debate as to whether this was originally the intention or not. I think we can set that aside for now. I think what's most worrisome is that it's very clear now that we have expansive objectives when it comes to this engagement. And those expansive engagements seems to be driven, as I wrote in that tweet, by tactical considerations rather than strategic. Let me give you this example. Imagine if in 2001, the objective had remained in Afghanistan to just take out al-Qaeda, decimate it, and make sure that it couldn't launch those terrorist attacks against the United States or anywhere else again. Would we have stayed that long? Instead, we expanded the objectives on the go to saying, now we're going to democratize Afghanistan. And we ended up staying for 20 years and we failed. That's the danger of having expansive objectives that are driven mainly by tactical events, perhaps a bit of hubris because things are going well, and they oftentimes come back to bite us. And that's what I fear in this situation. I think it's one thing to say that we should be defending Ukraine, but when we change the objective to saying that it's actually weakening Russia, that is a fundamentally different objective with a completely different timeline and completely different implications.
Yeah, what does that even look like or mean, given that there is no kind of qualitative endpoint on weakening Russia? Do you weaken a little bit? Do you weaken a lot? What is the metric by which you would assess how weak it needs to be? How is this not just an imperial project at this point? And how can someone like Jen Psaki, straight-faced look at the camera when statements of this have been made by Lloyd Austin and claim that this is not, in fact, a proxy war?
So I think you put your finger on it when it comes to the impreciseness of this objective. If it would have been, for instance, to make sure that Russia is pushed out of parts of Ukraine, and we go back to the way it was in December 2021, that would have been a clear objective. It would be qualitatively rather precise, as you put it. We would know when that is achieved. When we say weakening, and then we add to it to make sure that Russia cannot invade other countries again in the future, that is a very different proposition because Russia is actually bordering a lot of small countries. Are we saying that we are going to weaken Russia to the point in which this country with 6,000 nuclear weapons cannot invade any of those countries because it lacks the capacity? There's a different word for that. It's actually not even proxy war, it's war. Now, I think it's actually a good objective to be able to say we don't want Russia or any other country to be able to invade other countries. But there's two paths to that end goal. One is to say we're going to create deterrence, we're going to create arms control agreements, we're going to create diplomatic win-win solutions that not only takes away their ability to do so, but primarily takes away their desire to do so. Or we can say we're going to limit their resources, which means that we're going to cut them down in pieces. And that is war. And that is tremendously dangerous with a country that has 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Right. It's a subtle difference in some ways, but it is a difference between saying, look, if as a result of Putin's decision to invade his neighbor and start this really horrific war, if as a result of that, the Putin regime comes out weakened, I wouldn't shed very many tears about that, right? That would be a fine effect. But if that is the goal of what we're doing, then it could theoretically be that we prioritize, having that outcome over even the safety and the lives of the Ukrainians. If we are pushing them to hold on because we want to inflict more pain on the regime. Again, a regime that I think deserves pain. It's not that
exactly.
Like that's the bad part. The bad part is who suffers in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, you put it quite well, because the weakening of Russia as a side effect of pushing them out of their illegal invasion of Ukraine is a completely different thing. It's a side effect of the objective of defending Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine's territorial integrity is not violated. But when you switch it around and you say that the objective is the weakening of Russia, then Ukraine becomes secondary, but also everything else becomes secondary, and it's no end goal. And this is how, in the heat of the moment, in the hubris of success, we end up expanding our objectives, and then we end up in an endless confrontation. And then afterwards, we ask ourselves, how could we have been so unwise to go along with this? Well, we're in that moment right now. We've been in these moments several times before. Many of them have read about it in the history books. We're in the middle of one right now. And it's now we need to be as collected and as thoughtful as possible and not allow these type of expansive objectives or the expansion of our objectives, these endless expansions to take place, because it will cost us dearly.
Well,
yeah, and also the longer we are engaged in this process, even if the chance of a nuclear escalation is very small, I think it is extremely small. It's never happened before. The longer we are engaged in this type of thing, even a small chance, we're rolling a dice. It's a 1 in a million chance. Well, we're going to do it. We're going to do it again tomorrow. We're going to do it again tomorrow. We're going to do it again tomorrow. So even something with a small chance, the longer we stay this course, the more there. And that's true for Russia too. Again, we wish they wouldn't do what they're doing. Is horrible. They shouldn't do it for this reason, as well as many others. But that doesn't change the reality that what we're doing is also on us, and we can only affect what we're doing, right?
The fact that Putin and Russia is clearly the aggressor in this case does not mean that our own actions are inconsequential. We are still a superpower. What we do does matter. And what we do then as a result, we have to think through very carefully. What we say, we have to think through very carefully. And we have to be very well aware of the risks and the dangers of uncontrollable escalation, particularly when we're dealing with a country that also has 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Well, Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our Rising panel joins us next. We'll discuss mainstream media's continual outrage of Elon Musk's Twitter takeover. Stick around.